King Richard III.
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 A medieval king lost for more than 500 years, found beneath a modern parking lot. It sounds like a joke, but in 2012, that impossible headline became real. Archaeologists uncovered a skeleton under the streets of Leicester, and DNA soon confirmed what no one expected. The remains belonged to King Richard III, the last English king to die in battle. The villain of Shakespeare, the ruler history said was twisted in body and soul. The world celebrated the discovery as a miracle, but buried inside the same DNA testing that proved his identity was another result, one so disturbing, so politically explosive that it was quietly pushed aside and reduced to a footnote. For more than a decade, that detail sat in plain sight, ignored, until new genetic technology in 2025 forced historians to confront it, because the truth hidden in Richard III's blood doesn't just change how he died, it challenges whether he was ever a legitimate king at all.
Archaeologists behind the discovery of King Richard III's remains under a car park in Leicester, well, they were back at the site today to begin work on another new dig.
Richard III was never meant to be remembered kindly. In 1485, he became the last English king to die on a battlefield, cut down at the Battle of Bosworth after just 2 years on the throne. His enemies didn't just want him dead, they wanted him erased. After the fighting ended, Richard's body was stripped naked and slung over a horse like a trophy. He was paraded through the streets of Leicester, a public warning that the York dynasty was finished. There was no royal funeral, no marked grave. Richard was buried hastily in a shallow pit at Greyfriars Church, his body twisted to fit a space too small for him. It was a final act of humiliation, designed to deny him any dignity in death. When the monasteries were dissolved decades later, the church was torn down, the land sold off, and the grave's location forgot. Stories spread that his bones had been dug up and thrown into the River Soar, and over time, historians accepted the idea that Richard III was gone forever. But one person wasn't convinced, and her obsession would drag a forgotten king back into the light from the most unlikely place imaginable. The person who refused to let Richard III disappear was not a seasoned archaeologist or a powerful historian. She was a screenwriter named Philippa Langley, and her obsession bordered on the unreasonable. While most experts dismissed Richard's burial as lost to time, Langley spent years poring over medieval maps, property records, and faded references to Greyfriars Church. Again and again, her research pointed to the same spot, a completely ordinary city council parking lot in Leicester. Professionals told her she was chasing a fantasy. The popular theory said Richard's remains had been destroyed centuries earlier, dumped into the river and washed away. But Langley didn't let it go. She convinced the University of Leicester to take a risk, securing permission to dig in a place no one expected history to survive. In August 2012, the excavation began. On the very first day, the team uncovered human leg bones just beneath the asphalt. Almost immediately, the mood changed. This wasn't a random burial. Something about the location, the positioning, and the depth felt deliberate. The excavation had barely started, and already it was clear they hadn't just found a skeleton. They had found a story that refused to stay buried. As the excavation continued, the full shape of the grave began to emerge, and it was immediately unsettling. The skeleton, labeled simply Skeleton 1, belonged to a man in his early 30s. The grave was far too short for his body, forcing his head to rest at an unnatural angle. This wasn't the careful burial of a respected king. It was rushed, careless, and cold. Then came the injuries. The bones showed 10 separate wounds, 8 of them to the skull. This wasn't death from a stray arrow or a single fatal strike in the chaos of battle. 2 blows stood out as clearly lethal. One sword cut to the base of the skull, and another weapon thrust straight down through the top of the head. The pattern told a brutal story. Richard had been unhorsed, surrounded, and finished off in a violent frenzy. But the detail that made historians pause was his spine. The skeleton showed severe scoliosis, a sideways curvature that would have raised one shoulder higher than the other. For centuries, Tudor propaganda had portrayed Richard as a grotesque hunchback, a physical monster to match his reputation. The bones revealed the truth. The condition was real, but wildly exaggerated. Isotope analysis of its teeth told another story too, a diet rich in seafood and wine, food reserved for the elite. Everything pointed to a high-status life. Everything pointed to one conclusion. They were standing over the remains
descendants of a king. Even with the mounting evidence, the team knew bones alone weren't enough. To make a claim this extraordinary, they needed absolute proof. They needed DNA. That was the problem. Extracting usable DNA from remains more than 500 years old is notoriously difficult. Time shatters genetic material into tiny fragments, and the slightest contamination can ruin an entire sample. One stray hair, one skin cell, and the results become meaningless. Working in sterile conditions, scientists drilled into Richard's tooth and femur, carefully extracting what little genetic material remained. Their plan was to search for a living relative and compare the DNA. Most genetic markers reshuffle every generation, making them useless across centuries. But one type of DNA doesn't change. Mitochondrial DNA passes almost unchanged from mother to child, creating an unbroken genetic line through the female side of a family. Richard III had no surviving children, but he did have an older sister, Anne of York. Genealogists traced her maternal line across 17 generations, leading to 2 living descendants. When the mitochondrial DNA from the skeleton was compared to theirs, the result was unmistakable, a perfect match. The shared genetic signature was rare, found in only a tiny fraction of Europeans. The odds of coincidence were almost non-existent. In early 2013, the announcement was made. Skeleton 1 was, beyond reasonable doubt, King Richard III. The story should have ended there, but one final test was still waiting, and it would change everything. The final test was supposed to be a formality. Scientists decided to examine the Y chromosome, which passes almost unchanged from father to son. In royal families, this creates a genetic fingerprint that can be traced across generations of male heirs. If Richard III truly belonged to the Plantagenet line, his Y chromosome should closely match that of living male line descendants of his ancestors. It didn't. When the results came back, the match wasn't just weak, it was non-existent. Richard's Y chromosome bore no meaningful resemblance to the modern descendants linked to Edward III, the king from whom the Plantagenets claimed their right to rule. This wasn't a minor mutation or a statistical fluke. It was proof that somewhere along the royal family tree, a recorded father was not the biological father. In other words, history had been lying. The implications were staggering. Royal legitimacy in medieval England was built entirely on bloodline, the belief that kings ruled by divine right passed down from father to son. A broken paternal line didn't just create an awkward family secret, it threatened the foundation of an entire dynasty. And yet, when the discovery was announced to the public, this detail was barely mentioned. The world focused on the miracle of finding a lost king. Meanwhile, a genetic contradiction sat quietly in the background, raising a single dangerous question no one wanted to answer. Where did the bloodline break really happen?
Getting DNA out of ancient remains is a very tricky and long-winded process.
Inside the historical community, that unanswered question caused immediate tension. The DNA didn't just suggest a mistake, it forced researchers to confront 2 radically different explanations. In 2014, when the findings were formally published, the scientists presented both possibilities with careful, measured language. The first explanation was the safe one. The break in the Y chromosome could have happened centuries after Richard III's death, somewhere among his modern descendants. That scenario would limit the damage to a single noble family and leave medieval history largely intact. Embarrassing, yes, but not catastrophic. The second explanation was far more dangerous. The break could have occurred before Richard III ever took the throne. That would mean Richard himself, his brother King Edward IV, or even their father, Richard Duke of York, had no legitimate blood claim at all. If that were true, the Wars of the Roses, a brutal 30-year conflict that tore England apart, had been fought over a genetic lie. The researchers admitted they couldn't pinpoint where the break occurred. The technology simply wasn't advanced enough. By presenting both possibilities as equally likely, they softened the impact and buried the most explosive conclusion beneath academic uncertainty. The world moved on, treating the mismatch as a strange but unsolvable footnote. But science doesn't stop evolving, and within a decade, the tools needed to answer the question definitively would finally exist. For nearly 10 years, the mystery sat unresolved. The most dangerous question in English royal history left deliberately unanswered. Then, in 2025, genetic technology finally caught up. A new independent research team launched a full reanalysis using advanced long-read DNA sequencing, a method capable of examining large, continuous strands of genetic material rather than fragmented pieces. This time, there would be no ambiguity. The problem before had been simple but frustrating. Richard III's Y chromosome didn't match modern Plantagenet descendants, but no one knew which line was wrong. To solve that, the team needed an ancient reference point, someone who lived before any possible break could have occurred. They found it in John of Gaunt, the powerful Duke of Lancaster and son of Edward III, buried at Westminster Abbey. When John of Gaunt's DNA was analyzed, the results were immediate and devastating. His Y chromosome perfectly matched that of the modern Somerset family, descendants long believed to carry the Plantagenet male line. That alone ruled out the safe explanation. The modern line was intact. There had been no recent break, which meant the break had to be earlier. With statistical certainty approaching absolute, the conclusion became unavoidable. Richard III's Y chromosome did not belong to the original Plantagenet bloodline. The false paternity event occurred inside his immediate family tree. 5 centuries of uncertainty collapsed in an instant, and the spotlight shifted to a single generation, the one history had always whispered about but never dared to confirm.
With the timeline narrowed, attention turned to one man, Richard, Duke of York. He was the father of both King Edward IV and Richard III, and the architect of the Yorkist claim to the throne. And suddenly, a rumor dismissed for more than 500 years snapped into chilling focus. During the Wars of the Roses, enemies of the House of York spread a scandalous accusation. They claimed Richard, Duke of York, was not the biological son of his supposed father. According to the story, his mother, Cecily Neville, had conceived him while her husband was away on campaign. The rumor even named an alleged father, a handsome English archer, far beneath her station. At the time, it was written off as political smears, the kind of poison flung during civil war. But the 2025 DNA results changed everything. The genetic break could not be placed anywhere else. The evidence pointed directly to Richard, Duke of York, as the source, the man who ignited the Wars of the Roses by claiming his bloodline was purer than the reigning king's was almost certainly illegitimate himself. That realization detonates the entire family tree. If the Duke of York had no rightful claim, then neither did his sons. King Edward IV, the charismatic warrior who seized the throne, ruled without genetic legitimacy. His children, the infamous princes in the Tower, were never true heirs. And Richard III, the king history has condemned for taking the crown from his nephews, was bound by the same hidden lie. The white rose, it turns out, may never have belonged to the royal garden at all. Once that reality sinks in, the scale of the fallout becomes impossible to ignore. The Wars of the Roses were not a minor dynastic dispute. They were one of the bloodiest civil conflicts in English history. For more than 30 years, the country was ripped apart by 2 rival houses, each claiming the throne through blood and divine right. Tens of thousands died. Entire noble families were wiped from the map. Battles like Towton became slaughterhouses. In a single winter day, more Englishmen were killed than in any other battle before or since. All of it was justified by one question: who had the true claim to the crown, Lancasters or Yorks? The DNA now gives an answer no one expected. The Yorkist claim was built on a genetic error. From the very start, their bloodline did not qualify under the rules they were willing to kill for. That means the war itself was fundamentally meaningless, not in its suffering, not in its destruction, but in its cause. A generation of violence, betrayal, and execution was fueled by a claim that never existed. History's most famous royal feud collapses into something far darker, a national tragedy sparked by a lie no one could prove at the time. And once you accept that, even more unsettling questions begin to surface. Questions about what the people inside the York family may have known all along. This is why the discovery in 2014 was handled so carefully. Finding a lost king was something the world could celebrate. Admitting that his DNA undermined an entire royal dynasty was not. At the time, scientists could prove there was a break in the bloodline, but they couldn't prove where it happened. So the most dangerous implication was softened, framed as uncertainty, and quietly tucked away where few people would ever look. But DNA doesn't forget. And by 2025, the technology had advanced far enough to remove the doubt entirely. The evidence now points to a single conclusion: Richard, Duke of York, was illegitimate. His sons inherited not a divine right to rule, but a carefully maintained illusion. The Wars of the Roses, one of history's most brutal conflicts, were fought over a claim that was never valid in the first place. And that leaves us with one final, uncomfortable irony. The skeleton found beneath the Leicester parking lot belonged to a man history remembers as a king. He lived by the rules of blood, lineage, and legitimacy, and died defending them. But by those same rules, the crown he fought for may never have truly been his. The king they pulled from beneath the asphalt wasn't just lost to time. He was living proof of a lie that ruled England for generations. A truth buried for 500 years, finally exposed when no one could silence it anymore.